Okay, we're into week 3, and the topic this week is laws of nature. We found in many of the accounts of scientific explanation, laws played an important part, um, particularly for Hempel and Oppenheim, right? But Hempel doesn't really say a ton about what exactly counts as a law of nature. He does make a distinction between laws and accidental generalizations. Um, so, first of all, law is not going to be a very specific thing. It's not going to be Nate is less than 6'4", right? That just says something about a specific person. Um, Laws have to be more general than that, but also they can't just be accidental generalizations. So they can't be something like everyone in this room is 6'4". They need to be something stronger than that, right? But beyond that, Hempel didn't really give us a lot to sort of help us make that distinction in any rigorous way. So this week we're going to go through some accounts that try to do that, try to be more rigorous about what counts as a law. And once again, we're going all the way back to Hume, back to the 1700s, because as with many things, Hume kind of said a lot of this stuff first. Um, and this is going to be sort of a short lecture, and the next one, regularity accounts, also be kind of short. I guess I could have sort of combined them because regularity accounts are often sort of call themselves Humean, right? But it's also often the case that Humeans don't necessarily actually believe what Hume believed. Sometimes what Hume actually believed is sort of a matter of contention and interpretation. So I separated them out into 2 short lectures. So here's what Hume has to say about laws of nature. And then just like the problem of induction, where he never actually said the word induction, here he's not actually going to use the word laws of nature, but what Hume says often gets applied to what people now say about laws of nature in debate. So to sort of introduce the idea, Hume notes that there's different types of problems that you can run into when you're trying to just reason, right? Um, One of the kinds of problems that you run into is that the chain of reasoning, right, between sort of your premises and your conclusion is just so long that you think somewhere in there maybe you made a mistake. So if you've ever done like proofs in geometry or in logic, you might encounter that sort of problem, right? Where there's just it's so long and so complicated. Each step is relatively straightforward, but you might worry that somewhere in there there's a mistake. Um, but this isn't actually sort of the sort of mistakes in reasoning that Hume is concerned with here. He's concerned with another type of problem, and that is when you're trying to reason using concepts that are actually ill-defined. Um, and he's going to focus on some particular types of concepts that he thinks are not really well defined at all. And these he calls power, force, energy, or necessary connection. Um, and he kind of uses them sort of interchangeably here. They arguably are different things. I think maybe it's easiest to focus on the notion of necessary connection because that's basically what we're invoking, the concept we're invoking when we talk about a scientific law, right? If we want to say all F's are G's, that there's some necessary connection between being an F and being a G, right? This is the idea. So Hume just wants to go in and see if we can do a little better job of defining these terms. Is there something more we can say about them? He thinks they're not very complete the way we use them most of the time. Now, to set this up, Hume sort of has a very particular account of what a concept is, right? He's an empiricist, um, and so he thinks that all of our ideas, all of our concepts, have to originally bottom out in sense experience, right? That's the only basically, and this comes from Locke, right? But Locke says, look, your mind is just a blank slate until you get some kind of information, some kind of content in through your senses, right? So whatever you have in your mind, whatever content you might have in your mind, it must have come from your senses ultimately, right? Um, and this is uh, the assumption that Hume is working in, right? And this is going to color his analysis of these concepts of necessary connection. Again, sensation gives us our basic concepts: house, dollar, right? Stuff you can see. And then what happens is once you've got those basic concepts in your mind, now your mind can work on these, combine them, mix them, and maybe you can come up with a more complex concept like household economy, right? You have the concept of a house and family, and dollars and exchanges of dollars, all from things you've seen. You can sort of combine those concepts together and maybe get a more complex concept. So um, necessary connection seems like one of these complex concepts. And so if we want to know, right, what it means, or if we want to unpack it in a way that's less fuzzy, make it better defined, we want to trace it back, break it down into its component parts. And those component parts should have at some point come into us through our senses. And if we can get it down to those component parts, those basic ones should be much more clear and distinct, right? Much less fuzzy, right? Because it's just sensory evidence, right? Just like house, tree, right? Pretty clear concepts. He thinks if we break down necessary connection into those sensory concepts, we'll have a clearer idea of what we mean by it. Okay, so there must be some sort of original sensory images, right, that from which we constructed the concept necessary connection. And what Hume's going to argue in the end is that there actually isn't one, right? It doesn't bottom out in anything sensory whatsoever. And if that's the case for Hume, then it's not a good concept. It's an empty concept because they have to ultimately come from sensory experience because he's an empiricist. So take an example, right? Two objects interact. Say we got a couple billiard balls. You see one roll, it hits the other, then the other rolls. Do you see any necessary connection in there? Do we ever observe a necessary connection, right? A necessity that the next ball, when it was hit, would have to roll. Do you see the force, right? You see a ball hitting another ball, but do you see some force being transferred to the ball or some sort of arrow, right, pointing that directs where the ball has to go? Hume says, no, you don't. And in fact, I can show that you don't, because if you did know, then you'd be able to predict the consequences of everything you saw, right? You'd be a pool master, right? Because you would always know exactly where the ball is going to go. He says you can't do that. Okay, maybe there's something else. Maybe there's another sort of origin of this concept of necessary connection. Notice that there's other ways, right? There's other sort of causal interactions that we observe, not just objects bouncing around in the world. We also move our bodies using our wills, right? And that's sort of a different kind of thing, but it is a sort of force, right? Your will is sort of power that makes things happen. So maybe that's where we get this concept of necessary connection or secret force or whatever, right? It's when we say, I would like to lift my arm, and you, in fact, do, right? Maybe that's the basis of this notion, since we obviously don't see it from objects bouncing around the world. And Hume says, well, let's interrogate that. What do you actually observe when you will, right, that you move your arm and then you move your arm? Says, well, what you actually see is you experience yourself, right, making the decision or willing to move your arm, and then you see the arm moving. But again, all you see is two events, right? You don't actually see the connection between the two, the necessary connection, just like the billiard balls, right? You get the idea that one would follow the other, and you're even able to predict it sometimes because you've seen it happen so many times. But just like the billiard balls, if that was the first time you'd ever seen two objects bounce into each other, you wouldn't necessarily actually predict what would happen, right? And that, he says, is because you don't actually observe the force of the necessary connection. You just sort of get used to seeing it over and over, and you become accustomed, right? So, and like, here's an example, right? Here's to sort of reinforce the fact that you're not actually observing any willing, right? So I can't will my liver to do anything, right? I can't will my heart to beat or stop beating. Well, what's the difference? If I sit here and say, okay, heart stop beating, and it doesn't do anything, right? But I say arm move, and it moves. Well, what was the difference? Did I observe some difference between the two? In one case, the will worked. In one case, it didn't. He says no. You don't observe any difference, right? Again, it's always just a succession of events. A willing, a movement, a willing, a non-movement. Same thing in either case. So he's saying there's no extra ingredient there in the event where your arm moves, right? That you can observe. Ah, there I saw the necessary connection. He says no. You don't ever see it. Okay, so we don't apparently get the idea of necessary connection from objects in the world. We don't seem to get it from like inner sense of like, right, observing our inner workings of our mind when we will things to move. And a further example, right, to sort of drive home the point, imagine you were suddenly paralyzed, right? So right now we do move our arms. He says if you all of a sudden you woke up in the hospital, right, and you were unable to move your arm, you'd say arm move and it didn't. Again, you wouldn't actually see what the difference is. You wouldn't observe, the necessary connection has been broken, or the force, this time I didn't see the force moving my arm. He says, no, it's, again, just a series of events, right? One time it goes one way, another time it goes another way. So he says, we never observed it. Necessary connection does not come from outer sense or inner sense. He says, really, and anyways, from what they knew about the anatomy at that time, your will only moves sort of some neurons or something, or at the time they thought the nerves, which in turn then move other nerves, and then your muscle, then your arm. So it's really not part of my conscious experience that my will is moving a nerve, right? If anything, I think it's moving my arm, but he's already argued that that's not the case. Okay. He says, right, so again, he's just sort of considering more and more objections that people might bring up, right? Just people who might say, no, we can observe. I know how we observe, right, the sensory origin of the necessary connection. He says, if it's not the power of the will to move the body, maybe it's the power of the will to bring ideas into existence, right? That's another thing we can do. I can decide to think of a pink elephant, and I can imagine a pink elephant, right? So maybe that's how we observe, right, this notion of necessary connection. That's how we get the concept. So he says, well, first of all, it's pretty impressive if you think of it, right? Ideas, you can bring them out of nothing, right? You can will them from nothing, right? That's such an impressive power that, right, if it were there, right, to observe, you surely wouldn't miss it, right? But that's actually not how it happens, right? I just sort of often have ideas coming out of nowhere, right? And I don't anywhere notice the power that's accomplishing it. And then in a parallel argument to the case of the liver, sometimes I can control which ideas I have, and sometimes they just come to me, right? And again, I don't necessarily see a difference. Okay, so a lot of different arguments, right, from a lot of different angles. Point being, at no point do we ever observe the forces or necessary connections that appear to cause things in the universe to sort of interact and move. The sorts of things that you would think we would be talking about if we talk about universal laws of nature. And again, he doesn't talk about laws of nature, but this is what people ultimately take from it. Okay, one last shot. Maybe it's God, right? Maybe the necessary connection, the secret force, comes from God. He's the one, he intervenes every time a billiard ball hits another billiard ball, and he's the one that makes the next one move. Right? He's the one that makes your arm move when you will it. And we have God, right? Morgan Freeman. But again, if you're an empiricist, now you're saying, like, well, where do I get this idea of God? I've never seen God, right? If all my ideas come from sensation, I don't know where my God idea came from. So again, I mean, this is very convincing to Hume and his contemporaries, who are a lot of them were empiricists. Of course, if you're not an empiricist and you think that you can get concepts from other sources than from your senses, then you might not find any of these arguments as convincing. But this is Hume's line of argument, anyways. And I think if you're scientifically minded, you do tend to favor, right, and weight sensory evidence, right, more strongly. So I think it is still convincing to a lot of people. There are still empiricists out there. Okay, so to conclude, right, what we really observe then is just series of events, right? But there's nothing tying them together. There's no necessity, right? So he says they seem conjoined but never connected, right? And since our concepts only have content if they can be traced back to some impression, for an empiricist, it turns out that the concepts of power, force, necessary connection, they are empty. Unless, right, maybe what we really mean when we say power or necessary connection is just the thing that we observe, which is just constant conjunction of events, right? So we do seem to see that when one billiard ball hits another, the other one always moves, right? and they do it in the same way. If I hit it from the same angle, it flies off at the same angle every time, right? So we do observe this regularity, right? Now we saw in his argument for the problem of induction that we have no reason to necessarily believe that this regularity will continue. Like, we're not guaranteed that it will, but we do tend to just make this assumption. We make this leap based on our observations of regularity in the past, right? Whether or not it's justified, we do it. So we could have some concept of necessary connection if we sort of like lower our expectations on what that could mean. And all it really means is, well, we've seen it happen in the past the same way a lot of times. Maybe necessary connection just means regularity. And that's fine, right? We're certainly justified to claim that we've always seen what we've seen, right? Hume's not questioning that. You would not be justified in assuming that it will always continue in the same way necessarily, right? So the necessary part of necessary connection, Hume's kind of saying that's wrong, right? But maybe it's just sort of a shorthand for things happening the way I've always seen them happen. So again, Hume never mentions the word law, but necessary connection, I think, is a rough approximation of what laws of nature are supposed to mean, what they're supposed to be. They're supposed to necessitate what we observe. Why can't I just jump to the moon? Well, the laws of physics prevent it. They necessitate my staying relatively earthbound unless I have a rocket and a lot of fuel. Why must I grow old and die? Again, this is necessitated by laws of biology. But Hume's point is like, why? Why do I believe that in this necessity? Where does this come from? What sort of necessity are we talking about, right? What basis do we have for believing in that? So again, Hume has just inspired a lot of people. So in the next lecture, we're going to see a contemporary philosopher who takes Hume's basic idea and then forms it into account, what we call a regularity account of what a law of nature actually is.